Hey everybody, Mike B back with another video in the Vietnam War series. Been getting a lot of good feedback about this because people are for some reason into it. I don't know why. Might be the Ken Burns thing, might not be. It's also, getting to be further in the past and you can still talk to Vietnam vets, so that's probably why. But anyway, I wanted to kind of go over today some things that I've been seeing in the comments, and I knew they were gonna happen because I've known about these misconceptions and kind of like just understood facts about the Vietnam War. Specifically, in this video, I'm going to cover some statistics regarding like who actually fought in the Vietnam War from the United States. Yeah, I know other countries were involved. Like, we had a little thing in the comments about Australia. I know they were involved, but the majority of like foreign forces in Vietnam were American, unfortunately. So that's why I'm kind of sticking to this. I'll do some research in the future and hopefully try to get some like Australian stuff or Korean stuff, maybe knowledge. But for now, we're going to talk about American statistics. I've got two sources that are correlating, and then there's a bunch of other sources. I don't want to list a bunch of sources for the same information, so I just use the empirical kind of cross-examining way of doing things, and they were very consistent within 1% usually on a lot of these numbers. So first misconception we're going to really tackle is the fact that we're going to say men because only about 5,000, between 5 and 6,000 women were actually in Vietnam from 64 to 73. So I'm going to say men. Most of the men who died in Vietnam fought and died. Everybody thinks they were just poor draftees, conscripts. I've heard the term being thrown around, from lower class families who really didn't have any way to get out of the draft. They couldn't dodge it, and they were just down on their luck. And they had to. A lot of minorities too. A lot of African American people, because at that point Hispanic people were considered Caucasian. So for the purposes of these statistics, Hispanic people are included in the Caucasian numbers. So it says Caucasian, African American, or other, which is a very small percentage, like 1% usually. So for this, it's mainly going to be the disparities between Caucasian and African American people. We'll get into all that. So, African Americans were disproportionately targeted by the draft and kind of victims of it. And, a lot of them died in Vietnam and all that stuff. And it wasn't fair. So, these are all misconceptions that I'm going to cover kind of as we go because I've got them all compiled in this order, kind of. Another one that kind of ties into all what I've just been saying is that most of the people who were in Vietnam were very, very poorly educated, very stupid, not a lot of people with college degrees because they never went over there because they had the deferment, so they were just draft dodgers and sitting there protesting the entire war all the time and, just doing their thing, which we'll talk about as well. And then pretty sure that's about it. So yeah, and the last one is that most of the people in Vietnam that were drafted or were there were like 19-year-old kids, 18 and 19-year-old kids. That was, pretty much everybody who was there was 18 and 19. It was just so horrible and blah, 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 blah. So if you've made it through these first little batch of misconceptions, this is only a few of them too, because I cannot stand to make like a 1 hour long video kind of dispelling these misconceptions. So we'll just break this up. We'll call this part 1 of the misconceptions. And a lot of these facts are from Vietnam veteran organizations, and I chose to have a Vietnam Veterans Organization as my source for one of these, and just kind of a history website in general. It's .org, both of them. So I trust .org for statistics and scholarly articles a lot more than I do a .com or .net. So that's just a personal thing from college, I guess. I figured they're more consistent. Anyway, we'll get going on this. Sorry about the long-winded explanation, but it helps to kind of build into the context of what I'm going to be talking about. So, and you can go on and do research on your own and come up with these numbers too. It's pretty stone cold that these are consistent. A lot of research has gone into this. So draftees versus volunteers is what we're going to kind of talk about first. We're going to go relatively in order of what I just laid out there. So everybody thinks that, mainly draftees fought in Vietnam, conscripts, whatever you want to call them, and that they didn't really want to be there, and et cetera, et cetera. That is an absolute myth. And I don't know how that really became a thing. Maybe a lot of the draftees who actually served in Vietnam came back and were bitching about it, which is also unlikely, and in a large scale. And I don't know how that really got started. Maybe it was a propaganda thing to kind of fuel the anti-war movement, which is another video that I'll be discussing kind of independently, not really taking a side on that. But maybe it was for that purpose. I don't really know, to tell you the truth. There's probably a multitude of different reasons why that became so bloviated and blown out of proportion, and why people commonly believe that most people who fought in Vietnam were draftees. 25% of all the people who served in Vietnam were draftees. Okay, and the draft, as far as Vietnam was concerned, went on from 1965, or 1964 actually, to 1973. Okay, June 30th, 1973 was the last date that somebody was drafted ever in the United States. So it's late 1964, early 1965, the draft officially started for Vietnam. And what's really interesting is 25% of all people who were in Vietnam, 25% were draftees. The other 75% were volunteers. It's a pretty drastic number and pretty opposite of what, it's just commonly believed. So yeah, that's a pretty staggering statistic, right? Still the draft sucks and whatever, and it is what it is. We'll talk about that in another video. Again, I'm trying to keep this, we'll get going faster here now. So, but draftees did account for about 30%, 17,725 of combat deaths in Vietnam. So that's again, it's not as big of a number as most people think. And I think all the draftees went over there and they all got killed, and it was just horrible. By the way, this is from historyworld.org. I just want to throw the source out there because this isn't like, I didn't write this stuff. I didn't do the research. So somebody else did, historyworld.org, and then I'll tell you my other source when we get to that, all the information I pulled from there. So 30.4% of combat deaths in Vietnam were draftees. So again, that leaves about 70%, 69 to 70% of all combat deaths were volunteers, people who volunteered, joined willingly, were not drafted, and actually made it into country, which is another thing we'll talk about. There were 5,977, so we'll just say 6,000 reservists killed. So that was people that either volunteered to go themselves or were sent there to fill slots or something. That's not a very big number, but considering how little the reserves and National Guard actually were deployed to Vietnam, it's a big enough number. 6,000 reservists that didn't plan on really going, but National Guard 6140 served and 101 died. So I think it was from Indiana. There was a unit that it was actually did very well. I forgot exactly what unit and all that stuff. I'll do some research and make another video on that. But 101 National Guardsmen died in Vietnam. So yes, the National Guard was there. That was not a way to dodge the draft because they were still deployed, and they could have been deployed if they so chose. But it didn't go that way. So the total number of draftees between 65 and 73, 1,728,344. Now, what's really interesting is, of that number, only 38% of that number went to Vietnam and served in Vietnam in some capacity. Very interesting, isn't it? So not as many, like if you were drafted, you were not guaranteed to be sent to Vietnam. Very interesting, because usually you'd think it's the other way around. Like you get drafted, you're going to Vietnam, bam, 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 you're dead. You're more than likely to be killed. 70% of draftees were killed. And so this is why I'm kind of making this video. Bear with me here on my long-winded kind of explanation. The Marine Corps drafted 42,633 people. And again, like I said, the last man was drafted on June 30th, 1973. So I'm going to sneeze for a second. Excuse me. Now, that's just about draftees versus volunteers. So now we're going to kind of get into something that is just statistics-wise. This isn't like currently politically applicable, so don't jump on my shit for that, because there are a lot of misconceptions, especially with the climate now, looking back on becoming historical revisionists and applying modern societal norms and politics to past events, which isn't really good. But this is also a very common misconception that a lot of people use to kind of fuel, again, anti-war movements and anti-Caucasian movements, the divide and all that stuff. Not getting political, I'm just stating a fact. So what's weird is the thing I was talking about was that minorities were unfairly targeted in the draft, especially, and they were disproportionately killed, and they they died in larger numbers because they were poor and uneducated, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't volunteer for that crap. African American people didn't volunteer. Native Americans, Islanders, the 1% that's counted in those stats, didn't volunteer. They were all drafted. They were all victims. Sure, if you believe it that way, by all means, you're free to have your opinion, but I like to base my opinion off facts. 88.4% of the men who actually served in Vietnam were Caucasian. That's a pretty staggering number. 10.5% were African American, and then 1%, approximately belonged to other races, like again the Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, that kind of stuff. So it's weird that 70% of enlisted men that were killed were of Northwest European descent, aka Caucasian. Very interesting, huh? 86.8% of the men who were killed as a result of hostile action were Caucasian, and 12.1% were African American. Very interesting. And then 14.6% of non-combat deaths were among African Americans. 34% of African Americans who enlisted volunteered for combat arms. So that right there tells me that that's a pretty big number to volunteer. Okay, you're enlisting as an African American, right? Maybe it's a way to get money. Maybe you're not in a poor socioeconomic status. Maybe you just want to get out and do something. Just want to not have to worry about the draft and just get it over with. 34% of African Americans volunteered to enlist and volunteered for combat arms. Engineers, artillery, infantry, aviation, that kind of stuff, where you're going to get shot at. You're going to have a lot of contact. 34% of African Americans did that, volunteered. So that's an interesting statistic. African Americans suffered 12.5% of the deaths in Vietnam at a time where the percentage of African Americans of military age was 13.5% of the total population. So it's pretty similar to today's. It went down a little bit on the percentage of African Americans, but relatively proportional to today's overall population numbers, right? So it's interesting that of the casualties in Vietnam, it's a little bit less proportional, the amount of African American people who were killed in Vietnam than Caucasian people. It's very interesting, like the representation and kind of correlating with what made up the society, like the percentage. Very interesting to me. So that's why it kind of dispels that whole myth that African Americans were intentionally targeted and they were drafted more often, and more of them died in Vietnam and all that stuff. Very interesting stat. So I thought that was very illuminating as far as the racial tension thing. And I'll make more videos on kind of some things related to that in the way future. It gets dicey, and there's so many conflicting reports and sources that it'll be interesting. Now, here's where it gets interesting too, and I probably should have made this into another video, but I'm going to make this a long one. Hopefully you're still interested and you're still watching this, because these facts are really interesting to me. This is kind of like the macro stuff that ties into the micro stuff that we'll be talking about as this series progresses. So during the Vietnam War, this is from VVOF.org, Vietnam and Other Veterans of Florida.org. So this is actually an association made up primarily of Vietnam veterans in Florida. So during the Vietnam War, almost 80% of those who enlisted, volunteered, had high school diplomas. 80%. That's insane, right? And the percentage was higher for draftees. So draftees had a higher than 80% rate of having a high school education, which at that time was a good thing. World War II, it was... what is that? Yeah, I didn't get the stats for that. But World War II, it was like, I think 45% or 55%, somewhere in there, of all draftees and enlisted men had a high school diploma. So that says a lot. It was up until that point the most educated military in American history, which is very interesting. So the percentage was highest for draftees, even though at the time only 65% of military-age males had high school diplomas. So you're talking a 15% increase among enlisted volunteers, and draftees are higher than that. That's insane. So that dispels that myth that everybody was uneducated, stupid, bumpkins that just, got shot and got everybody killed because they were dumb. Not true at all. And so throughout the Vietnam era, the median education level of the enlisted man was about 13 years. So yeah, high school diploma. And then proportionately, 3 times as many college graduates served in Vietnam than they did in World War II. So they don't have the numbers up there, but that's got to be a lot, like percentage-wise, 3 times more. So that's, well, maybe it might be numbers. Who knows? Because, I mean, yeah, it was interesting. And we'll talk about college graduates in another video as well. I know I've got about 10 videos I'm going to have to do, but that was another misconception that we'll get into. And then the really big one that I kind of touched on was that everybody was just this wet behind the ears, fresh out of high school, 18, 19-year-old kid who, just went over to Vietnam and got killed. Not true. An analysis of data from the Department of Defense shows the average age of men killed in Vietnam was 22.8 years old, or we'll just say 23. That's a big difference from 18 and 19 years old. There were more 52-year-olds killed in Vietnam than there were 17-year-olds, by far. If you look at that number, I think it's like 52-year-olds were killed, and I think 12 or something 17-year-olds. It's on one of these sites. You can check that out. Very interesting. So yeah, that's another common misconception. Same thing in World War II. The average age was 26. Everybody's, oh, they're all so young. They're 18, 19. Hey, a lot of 18, 19-year-olds are full of piss and vinegar and they volunteer for stuff. But, there are people who are older who also want to volunteer and serve their country and make a difference. So that's just something to consider, right? Because I've seen a lot of that on like Facebook. You see pictures of like World War II vets in Vietnam. And, oh, they're just babies. They're kids. Sure, those people might be, but they also could be 23 years old, because a person that's 23 could definitely look like they're 18, 19. You don't know how old that person is unless you have like documentation. So yeah, 23 years old was the average age of the soldier that was killed in Vietnam. Very interesting. Now, here's the socioeconomic kind of caveat. And then we'll go to like losses by region of the US, and then we'll wrap the video up. Interestingly enough, so 76% of the men sent to Vietnam are from lower or middle working class backgrounds. That's fairly concurrent with what you hear, lower or middle class. We're just going to say average Americans, right? At that point, 3/4 of them had family incomes above the poverty level, and 50% were from middle income backgrounds. There you go. This is from historyworld.org. Again, we're back to that because they had this information way down at the bottom. And then some 23% of Vietnam vets had fathers with like professional, like white collar jobs, basically, which is very interesting. So yeah, your father's a technical or an engineer or something, or a doctor or something like that, and you are enlisting or being drafted more likely enlisting to go to Vietnam. Very interesting. And then that just means that a lot of average people were volunteering or drafted. I mean, you get paid, you get an adventure at that time. And another misconception is that the wealthy all the time would just pay some cash and not have to go. Sure, it happened, but there was also lower middle class people who kind of talked to their local draft board and were convincing enough to have little Johnny not have to go to Vietnam because he's physically unfit, or join the military, not even go to Vietnam. But that was their mentality. So that happened a lot. Again, I'll probably cover that in a video in the future. But 76% of the men were lower middle class, very concurrent with the percentage of the population at that time. Okay? So again, this is just like, nobody was really targeted. Statistically, you can't say that anybody was specifically targeted on a large scale, whether they be lower class, African American, uneducated. All these statistics that are concurrent on several different sources, like reliable sources, would say to the contrary. So, sorry this video is so long, but I thought that all these things went together. That's why I separated. There's a lot more misconceptions and then statistics to kind of debunk those, but I'm going to try to break that up because I hate watching like 3-hour-long YouTube videos of somebody talking. But I figured I'd just kind of lay this out here early on in this series so that a lot of these misconceptions stop being thrown around as a fact in the comments and just in life, because Vietnam, it wasn't that long ago. I have like people who are literally friends who were in Vietnam. They're older than me, but they're friends. Like that's how recent it was, like for somebody my age. Very interesting. It had been over for like 15 years when I was born, which isn't that long. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this video up. I appreciate you watching. Let's get some discussions going in the comments below. I'd like to hear what you think after you've seen this. It's kind of like getting a red pill about Vietnam. Everything you or most people that really just kind of know at surface level don't really think about these things like this. Statistically, it's just kind of, oh, hearsay, bam. So I'm curious as to what your reaction is going to be after being kind of red-pilled by this information, these statistics. These aren't my opinions, these are actually facts. So very interesting to see what you think. Hopefully you learned something. I appreciate you making it this far in the video. Again, I know what it's like to watch somebody talk and rant on a YouTube video and kind of quote things. It gets painstaking, but you've made it this far. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Comment below with, let's get some discussion going on this. And then hit the notification bell, follow me on Facebook, all that good stuff. And we'll see you on the next video.